With Ukraine fighting for its very survival and looking desperately for help wherever it can find it, attention here inevitably has turned to Canada's ability to meet our international obligations and our own defence needs. The federal government has pledged to spend a good deal more over the next 5 years. Billions more, in fact. Is it enough? Or more than enough? Let's ask. In the nation's capital, the former commander of the Canadian Army, Andrew Leslie, who's a retired Canadian Armed Forces Lieutenant General. He's also the former Liberal MP for Orleans or Orléans, depending on what side of the Ontario-Quebec border you're on. Peggy Mason is here. She's the president of the Rideau Institute and former Canadian ambassador for disarmament to the UN. Dave Perry is president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, an independent foreign policy and defence think tank that has received funding from the Defence Department and industry. And in Victoria, British Columbia, David Pugliese, journalist at the Ottawa Citizen, who's been reporting on the military for about 4 decades now. And as I welcome all of you to TVO tonight for this discussion, we want to just put some numbers up to set the table for the discussion to come. So I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond. Here we go. Money for the military. The Canadian government promised $6.1 billion over 5 years in new money for defence, with an additional $1.4 billion spent each year after that. What do we spend on defence in this country? $33.6 billion. That works out to 1.36% of our GDP. That's a long way from 2. The latest budget would mean defence spending would account for 1.5% of our GDP by the year 2026. And let's do one more page of this. Having said that, NATO wants member countries, as you know, to get to 2% of their GDP by the year 2024. That means we need to spend about 30 to 40% more to get there. That's around $17 billion more per year. The last time Canada hit the 2% figure was when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister. 10 members of NATO meet the 2% goal, including the US, the UK, Poland, and Greece. We currently rank 25th out of 30 in NATO membership when it comes to defense spending. The average is 1.76%, and we're below that, of course. But we are the 6th largest spender in terms of absolute dollars. All right, let's dive into this. Former heads of the Canadian Forces have been saying for a long time that the military are on the brink of collapse due to a lack of funding. General Leslie, let me get you to start on this. Your former colleague, Vice Admiral Mark Norman, warned, quote, "We are rapidly approaching the point where our military is considered irrelevant." Do you sign on to that?
I sign on with the idea that the Canadian Forces needed an urgent injection of funds. And let me try and explain why. First and foremost, the numbers you presented, Steve, though accurate, they also include Veterans Affairs. In terms of the actual defense spending, right now the Armed Forces is 7,000 people short. They need about $1 billion a year more just to keep the spare parts and the training budgets going. We are the only nation that I can find whose army does not have a ground-based air defense system to protect it from aircraft and drones. Our Carl Gustav anti-tank system was first introduced into service in 1946. 1946. There's no decision made on a medium ground-based air defense system. There's no decision yet made on warship replacements. There's no decision yet made on submarine replacements. There's no decision made on a maritime patrol aircraft or a family of drones. I could go on. The bottom line is it's kind of like investing in a really nice house, but not spending a small amount as compared to the original investment to get the heat going and the lights on. And right now, our Arctic is undefended.
Well,
I'm not saying we have small there. We have nothing.
All right, let me do a quick follow-up. Would you say that the last budget at least paid to put the lights on?
No. I'll tell you why. Because if you give $8 billion over 5 years, but in the previous 7 years, you haven't let D&D spend $12 billion, about $2 billion per year that it was supposed to get, that's a delta of $4 billion. On top of that, it came with strings. A whole bunch of that was supposed to go to the renewal of the North American Air Defense Agreement, which alone is going to probably cost $10 billion. Oh, and by the way, it's supposed to do Arctic defense. And newsflash, it's going to cost an awful lot more than 1.5 or 1.6 billion to get a proper Arctic defense going. And let's not forget the Russian bear's just on the other side of the ice cap.
All right, David Pugliese, what do you think about what the general just had to say?
Well, it's the same thing that I've been hearing for the last 40 years. I've written stories in the 90s. We're close to collapse. 2000s, the early 2000s. Now we've got this same cycle going. Retired Defense Chief Rick Hillier said there isn't any fuel for our ships. So every ship is tied up. Well, I checked with the Defense Department. That's total bunk. We have 7 warships at sea right now. So there's always, the department and national defense will always say it needs more money, and there's a lot of hype that accompanies that. General Leslie mentioned the Carl Gustaf. Well, our Carl Gustafs were bought in the 1980s, but it's not the actual tube. The launcher that is important. It's the ammunition, and the Carl Gustaf manufacturers are making high-tech laser-guided missiles. So it's quite an effective weapon, for instance.
Let me get the other 2 guests to comment, and then I'll get General Leslie to come back in on this. Peggy Mason, whose side on this are you on?
Well, the figures that were shown at the beginning don't include the fact that we are halfway through a 10-year increase, a 70% increase over 10 years. Back in 2017, the Liberal government committed to a 70% increase in defense spending over 10 years, which, if you add the new $8 billion that's just been added, amounts to $266 billion by 2026, 2027. And it means that the defense budget, which at the beginning of this 10-year cycle was $18.9 billion, so just under $19 billion, will be at $41 billion by 2026, 2027. So we're talking about this latest $8 billion being on top of a massive increase that we're only halfway through. And General Leslie talks about this lost 12 billion, which is for the last essentially, the last 5 years in the latest report by the Parliamentary Budget Office, but it goes back earlier. DND has been unable to absorb all of the money pledged. And that's because, of course, there are so many major equipment programs, complicated equipment procurement programs that take a lot of time, that DND has been unable to spend all of the money. It's been able to spend the bulk of the money that's been pledged, but not all of it. But this is not lost money. One of the things that the Liberals did in 2017 in that defense policy was allow that money. The money doesn't lapse. The money stays with the defense. So there's no lost $12 billion. The $12 billion is still there. And as we go through this procurement process, it will be spent. So these are massive increases we're talking about. And the fact that, the retired generals say, we're on the brink of collapse, as David Pugliese said, we've heard that refrain over and over and over again. And it's clearly not on the brink of collapse. We have these major programs going through, which are going to take some time.
I know. I can see Andrew Leslie there. He's champing at the bit to get back in, but I'm going to beg his indulgence to hang in there for another minute, because Dave Perry, I still want to get you on the original premise of whether or not our military is on the verge of collapse, or is that an exaggeration? What's your view?
I think that's a significant exaggeration. Our forces aren't on the verge of collapse. I do think, though, that there's a disconnect in a funding space between what they've been asked to do and what they've been resourced to do over the last several decades. There's a planned increase, but to General Leslie's point, and from what Ms. Mason was saying, we haven't been able to get that money out the door. And while the forces are allowed to basically keep that funding, when they aren't able to spend it in year and it gets reshuffled to a future year, you're getting yesterday's money at tomorrow's interest rates. And interest rates at the moment are at a multi-decade high. So that's a significant problem. And while the Liberals' defense policy in 2017, I think on the whole was quite good and laid out a sound plan for the forces, there are funding shortfalls that have emerged since then. And the 2017 plan had a large IOU when it came to continental defense. So moving forward, I think finding the resources to implement on that multi-year effort on continental defense and strengthening our ability to defend ourselves against air threats in particular is where the real funding shortfall lies.
General Leslie, you got a bunch of people from Missouri here. When it comes to your original comments, what do you want to come back on?
Well, I never actually said that they were close to collapse.
No, that's
And
true.
the armed
Mark Norman
forces
said
has-
that.
And Mark's more than entitled to his opinion. He earned his the hard way, just like I did. Having said all that, the armed forces has great capability in terms of its troops. It has certain technological aspects which are first rate. But now that we have the Russian bear rampaging across the plains of Ukraine, slaughtering innocents, literally at the doorstep of NATO, the change to the world order is fairly profound. And there's every expectation that the vengeful Russian bear will in some way, shape, or form loom as an ever-present threat on the horizon for the next couple of decades, if not longer. So it behooves us to prepare now for the worst case scenario, which is war. And like all soldiers who fought in wars, I'm not keen on them. But let's prepare and invest now in a variety of equipment suites which could better defend or surveil our Arctic, get some basic capabilities for the Army that are dramatically missing, get the new ship program, the new warship program replacing our quite old frigates underway, the new supply ships rolling out of the dockyards, and I could go on for some time. All that requires an investment. And by the way, Canada's GDP is the same as Russia's. So yes, when it's a percentage of a larger number, obviously the figure is big. We have resources to pay. We also have international obligations to meet. And quite frankly, as one of the most powerful and wealthiest nations in terms of economy, certainly within NATO, I think it behooves us as a nation who's benefited from the NATO alliance for so long to pull a proportional and fair share.
Let me put that to David Pugliese. Russia, under Putin, has proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is a massive threat to the current international rules-based system of the world's countries getting along. Does it, as the general suggests, behoove us to spend more to be prepared for that threat?
Well, it disturbs me when I hear about war, that we could go to war with Russia. If that happens, we're in World War III, and we're talking nuclear weapons. And I don't think many of us are going to last that much longer if that takes place. Secondly, with the Ukraine invasion, I think what's happened is Russia has shown that it isn't this mighty force that we've thought they were all along. They can't even do a ground invasion of a country that's right beside it. They're having supply trouble. They're having morale issues. The Russian bear is shown to be quite weak.
They're still killing Ukrainians every day.
100%, but that doesn't mean that they can successfully take on the 30 member nation alliance of NATO. You've got, when you have all those 30 nations together, that's a formidable force. So yes, they're taking on Ukraine, but it's a whole different matter when they're going to be facing NATO.
Let's get to the significant commitment that all NATO countries are supposed to fulfill, and that is, Peggy Mason, the issue of 2% of our gross domestic product being spent on the military. We're a long way from there, even with the increases in the just released budget of the current Trudeau government. How important do you believe it is for Canada to hit that 2% mark?
I think the 2% goal is nonsensical. It's an arbitrary number that suggests that somehow, which has to be projected out into the future, and doesn't, I mean, the issue is, what are the threats? It's an assessment of the threat, and it's assessment of the various means which can change over time, and an assessment of your means and capabilities to respond to those threats, and also looking at non-military measures to respond to the threat. So, this was a number that the Americans browbeat NATO into accepting as a goal, and I think, I mean, we are the 6th largest contributor, military spender in NATO. The countries ahead of us have larger economies. We have obligations in North America and in Europe, and I think we're meeting those obligations. So I really reject this very, very arbitrary measure.
Dave Perry, what's your view of the 2% number?
So I would agree that it is arbitrary in the sense that I think it would be very difficult to claim that if we only spent 1.99% of GDP, we'd fundamentally not be measuring up in terms of the level of commitment. But at the same time, on one sense, it's the target the alliance agreed to, and we are now increasingly alone in the last about a month and a half amongst NATO allies at not actually making a commitment to at least move to a higher level of expenditures given the strategic environment. So you'll note that the budget that was published last week didn't actually make a commitment to get to 1.5% of GDP. The finance officials in the budget and in some stories leaked ahead of time basically said if you do the arithmetic, we're hoping to get there by year 5. Given our track record at actually meeting spending targets in out years, which the 5th year would be, I think that's a pretty tenuous signal. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that while it is arbitrary whether or not you're exactly at that level or not, we today are still coasting on some of the coattails of investments that we made when we did spend at that level back in the 1980s. The ships that our sailors are sailing around in today, about half of that fleet was delivered. The spending was going on it when we were spending at that level, and that's when we bought the fighter aircraft that we still have our pilots flying. So while in a sense, it is arbitrary. When you spend at that higher threshold, it gives you a much more significant base of capability to operate from, and we are still today coasting on decades ago investment when we were spending at a higher level.
Well, General Leslie, if that number is considered too arbitrary, let's just consider our reputation in general. We know the old expression, walk softly and carry a big stick. The Canadian academic Dennis Stair says Canadian foreign policy is more akin to speak loudly and carry a bent twig. What do you think our reputation among NATO is these days?
I think the people who actually serve in the Canadian Armed Forces still enjoy a stellar reputation for their individual attributes and skills, but I do know that we are not held in the same high regard that we have been over previous decades. I think there's a great and growing frustration with government vis-a-vis their wise and profound pronouncements and lengthy speeches, but in terms of action, not so much. For example, switching to peacekeeping, Canada has about 50 peacekeepers, that's a 5 and a 0, deployed over the course of the last year in terms of an annual deployment. So we've got 50 people overseas serving under a blue beret. That's about the size of a medium school bus. We have about 1,000 dedicated to NATO, which is far lower than it ever used to be. And now that the Russian bear is rampaging and slaughtering Ukraine citizens, it would certainly behoove us to step up our game and perhaps forward deploy elements to Latvia, where we have most of the 500 or 600, to give them an increasing sense of security and to be there just in case whatever may happen. And let's not underestimate the Russian bear. Putin is probably not what you and I would consider normal. I think he's a sociopath, and it's really difficult to predict what he's going to do next. By the way, a whole bunch of folk immediately prior to Putin invading the Ukraine, when he had 220,000 troops massed along the border, were still saying, don't worry, it's a training exercise. Nothing bad's going to happen. How'd that work out?
Well, David Pugliese, that's why we as Canadians have to ask the question, I think, if Russia, under Putin, decided to put submarines into our Arctic Ocean and come near our shores, what capability would we have to deter that?
Well, the only capability that a nation would have to deter that would be nuclear submarines to go under the ice, and as well surveillance aircraft and that type of thing. There's the Canadian Forces wants to get a submarine program underway, but there's estimates of that costing up to $60 billion. Australia is going nuclear, and they're talking in figures of 100 billion, 170 billion. And I don't think that's something you can sell to the Canadian public, particularly when there's a lot of pressures on the economy and for healthcare and that type of thing.
Peggy Mason, is Russia's nosing around in our waters on our northern border something you think we ought to be concerned about?
Well, we certainly need to have as good a surveillance capability as we possibly can, so we know what's going on. But I want to come back to a key point here, and that's the changed strategic environment. I mean, there is a huge lesson from what's gone on, what is going on right now. And that is that and that leads to the question of when we look at why is NATO not intervening? Why are they not directly intervening to help Ukraine? And the answer is simple, is that Biden understands extremely well, and Putin signaled this right off the top with his nuclear saber rattling, NATO stay out. He understands, as Russia understands, that there cannot be a conflict, a direct military conflict between two nuclear-armed, highly nuclear-armed adversaries. So that is what the big lesson is. So talking about, spending a lot more money on defense in the North, there is no defense against strategic nuclear weapons, against intercontinental ballistic missiles. I mean, even long-range cruise missiles, even some of the conventional hypersonic missiles. The defense is deterrence. And that's the overriding lesson of what is happening right now, is that we are seeing in real time that the United States has faced up and realized that all the talking about limited nuclear war fighting and all the talking about having a conventional nuclear war, and that's the argument for more and more spending. Oh yeah, there's no danger of nuclear weapons confrontation. We can have a conventional war and it won't escalate. Well, all the evidence, of course, all the wargaming suggests exactly the opposite. But clearly, when push comes to shove, and United States and NATO were faced with the possibility of a direct military engagement with a nuclear-armed superpower, they realized that the risk was catastrophic. And therefore, the lesson is not more and more and more conventional defense spending for weapons that'll never be used, but a very razor-sharp focus on what do we need to do to stabilize nuclear deterrence. And endless arms racing is just making the situation far more dangerous.
General
So
Leslie,
that's the lesson.
General Leslie wants to comment on that.
Putin wouldn't have attacked the Ukraine unless he thought he could get away with it. Now, the Ukraine is doing an excellent job of killing his tanks and his guns and his soldiers in large numbers. We'll see how it all ends out, but all our sympathies lie with Ukraine. One reason why NATO had no option but to watch and provide support, as they could get away with, is quite frankly, they weren't ready to try any other option because there had been a peace dividend over the last couple of decades. And instead of having a bulwark force along the inter-NATO border, there was nothing there apart from local troops. The United States, bless them, immediately deployed as a signal to Putin, don't go a step further. And obviously Putin is going to think really hard about doing so. But when we're faced with a national leader such as Putin, who is not rational by yours and my standards, what happens if he does take a poke into the Baltic states, for example? If we don't have conventional forces, that means that NATO would have to resort to the first use of nuclear weapons to stop him, which, by the way, the antecedents of mutual assured destruction posited by gentlemen such as Herman Kahn in his On Thermonuclear War, written in 1960, clearly indicate the thinking of the time which still exists, that in fact, if you don't have conventional forces, it gives the national governments of the West no choice but to do as you suggest, which, by the way, Peggy, is madness. That is absolutely a non sequitur. So if you don't have conventional forces, your government has no options. Oh, second point.
I did not say no conventional forces. I said ever increasing spending on conventional forces instead of ignoring the real dynamic is the problem. I mean, at no time did I say, oh, we're going to get rid of conventional forces.
Right,
and NATO and the United States has massive conventional capacity. And what this conflict has shown, as David Pugliese has pointed out, is just like during the Cold War, Russia's conventional capacity was vastly exaggerated. And we are seeing that in real time. So all of this exaggerated hype about what this terrible war in Ukraine actually demonstrates is really playing on the fears of Canadians. I mean, the suggestion that Russia is going to attack Canada, which means attack North America, which means attack the United States. $889 billion a year is their defense spending. So
can I get a word in edgewise?
These are.
Okay, let's let General Leslie come in here. Let's let the General respond.
Thank you. So let's just take this one bite at a time, if I may. First off, I didn't suggest Russia would attack Canada. But let's say, for example, someone who has demonstrated he has no respect for the rules of international law and has already launched a variety of claims against Canada's Arctic territory decides, you know what, next year with my pretty large fleet of icebreakers and all those new support bases for the military that Russia's recently built within striking distance or supporting distance, I'm going to install 50 new oil wells in those pristine waters of the Arctic. That's not a hostile act per se, and we have nothing with which to intercede. We have no, going back to your point, deterrence forces available. And without deterrence, without some capability to show that the Arctic is actually under our sovereignty, we leave ourselves vulnerable to the irrational state actor. And I'm sure most people, especially the brave citizens of the Ukraine, would agree that someone as bloodthirsty and ruthless as Putin is by no means a rational state actor. Ergo, you do need conventional forces as a deterrence. And by the way, it's only a real deterrent value if they can fight.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here, friends, because I want to pursue this issue of whether we have the equipment necessary to do whatever it is we may want to do, depending on which mission of our guests is being followed. And to that end, we collected a bit of a list here from the National Post and Global News, who have put the following forward. Our soldiers are apparently using, still, World War II-era Browning 9mm handguns as their standard issue sidearm. We've apparently been trying to replace them for more than a decade. We only retired the 114-year-old Lee Enfield rifle from frontline service a few years ago, becoming the last national military in the world to do so. We were apparently, again, using a version of this rifle in the Boer War. That's 100 years ago or more. Canada's Victoria-class submarines were already secondhand when we purchased them in the 1990s. They've been breaking down and barely making it out to sea, and we want to use them into the 2030s. The Sea King helicopters were flying for 55 years before they were replaced. And replacing our fleet of CF-18 fighter aircraft took 12 years. They're now approaching 40 years old. Looks like we're going to go with the F-35s, even though the government said they didn't want to go with the F-35s once upon a time. Okay, Dave Perry, figure all that out for us, please. Are we in need of a massive equipment upgrade, in your view?
I think we are. I mean, there are projects to move and replace everything on that list, as far as I'm aware, other than the submarines. But the point is that we've been underinvesting for about 20 years. So we're making up for lost time, which is putting the onus on spending more today than we would have had to had we kept a more regular and sustained pace of investment. But we didn't. And that's left us in a situation where right now our fighter pilots could be flying literally the same airplane that one of their grandparents could have. And that's endemic across the forces in a few areas. And I think that's why some people have said that we're at the risk of becoming irrelevant, which is I think, a fundamentally different way of categorizing things than saying that we are on the verge of collapse. When you have 40-year-old equipment, your equipment is several generations of technology out of date. Doesn't mean that it can't be moderately effective, but it does mean that it's nothing close to the current state of the art. And it does mean that when, as an example, you're comparing it to things that have been bought in the last 5 or 10 years, they just don't have the same level of technical capability, and they're not as operationally relevant. So bringing their suite of our forces up to par with modern technology, and then keeping us on a pace of investment to keep those regularly replaced, so you don't have a future situation where people can be basically using the same kind of a weapon that multiple generations of their family could have.
David Pugliese, what's your view on that?
So you can cherry pick anything you want. And here, I'll give you a different list. So we're going to be spending $1 billion on new trucks. Bids are coming in this year for $5 billion worth of drones. We have a new armored tactical armored patrol vehicle. We have a modern fleet of light armored vehicles, some of the best in the world. I think General Leslie put some of that in motion, and there's new vehicles that are being delivered right now. So as far as that, and as well, we have new search and rescue aircraft coming this summer. So you can cherry pick all you want, but there's a lot of equipment programs going on. And one of the main issues, though, is the massive amount of waste on these procurement programs.
We've just got a few minutes left here, and I do want to get your view. We'll see how many we can get in on this. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly said something that got really picked up and sent around the country a few days ago, namely that Canada, quote, is not a military power. She said, rather, we are, quote, good at convening. General Leslie, what did you think when you heard those comments?
To be honest, I winced. I know Minister Joly very well. I was her first chief government whip. I take a great note of the fact that I think 2 nights later at a symposium in Toronto, she made a point of saying how she valued the Canadian Armed Forces and how the armed forces needed more investment. So I think the two sort of cancel each other out. But the point, I guess, or one of the points, is that there is a public perception that Canada is not that which it was in terms of its military abilities or its willingness to participate on the international stage and help enforce or compliance with international peace and security. By the way, that's one of the fundamental tenets of our foreign policy, I think, because the last time I saw a written foreign policy issued by a federal government was, I think, 20 years ago. So maybe it's time not necessarily for a new defense policy, because I think the one we've got now is okay. We just got to fund it and solve the procurement issues. But what we really need is a foreign policy review, considering all the changes that are imposed on the system by, what's going on or what's happened over the last 6 weeks.
Peggy Mason, I do well remember General Rick Hillier, when he was chief of the defense staff, saying that the Army's job is essentially to go overseas, find and kill, I think the word he used was the scumbags who were behind the war in Afghanistan. And then there are other views that suggest that the Canadian military is pretty good at convening and doing more social work, if you want to put it that way. Where are you on that continuum?
Well, I mean, it's in the quote you're talking about with respect to Rick Hillier, and I was involved in the, I was a external faculty member of Pearson Peacekeeping Center for 13 years and was involved in NATO's training for stabilization operations, including Afghanistan and including when Rick Hillier led ISAF-5. And that comment was made with respect to Afghanistan. And look at what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, those of us from the very beginning were saying it's not going to end through military means. The Taliban are not going to go away. There has to be a comprehensive peace process, an inclusive peace process, exactly what we called the Taliban to do when they finally took over after 20 years. So really, what the Afghanistan experience demonstrates is that the military has to be a support to an overarching political diplomatic process. And in fact, that also applies with respect to Ukraine. Part of the problem here, this has to end through a negotiated deal. Actually, most of the outline of the deal is on the table, but United States is not supporting it. So we might have been able, we probably could have prevented this conflict in the first place, not in the last few weeks before when Putin had made up his mind, but earlier than that, had we really engaged in the diplomatic track. So we
okay,
are. So
forgive me. Let me jump in here.
adjunct.
Forgive me, Peggy. Let me jump in because we're less than a minute to go, and I really want to hear Dave Perry on this as well. Should our Army be a killing machine, or should it be involved more on the social work side of things, as some people have put it?
I think it should be involved broadly in support of Canada's national interests, which would include things like being able to be better positioned to respond to climate disasters in Canada, which they're being called to do, but haven't gotten that as a specific set of taskings. But if I go back to the minister's point, I mean, I would love for what she's saying about Canada to be a convening power to be more true. I think that we have become in the last several decades overly parsimonious when it comes to our international investment writ large. We should be spending more on all the different elements of Canada's international role in the world, our diplomatic corps, as well as our international aid and development. I think we've unfortunately developed across the spectrum of our international engagement a reputation for being rich, which is why the absolute spending is fairly high. But when you express that as a share of our economy, whether or not it's the share of our GDP going to defense or the share of our GDP going towards international development, we're rich, but we're cheap. And we don't actually make proportional investments like a lot of other countries do, and as in several cases we have committed to do.
And that will be the last word for this debate. David Pugliese, Andrew Leslie, Peggy Mason, Dave Perry, really good of the four of you, to join us here on TVO tonight for a very important and timely debate for our country. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.